For more than half a century, a quiet question has followed the name Marvis Frazier wherever he went. It lingered in boxing gyms, echoed in locker rooms, and surfaced in conversations whispered just out of earshot. What was it really like to grow up as the son of one of the most feared and respected heavyweight champions in history? Was Joe Frazier the father the world imagined him to be? Or was there another truth hidden behind closed doors, far from cameras, crowds, and championship belts? Now, at 64 years old, Marvis Frazier has reached a moment of reflection that few can avoid and even fewer choose to confront publicly. He is nearly the same age his father was when he passed away, and that proximity to time has sharpened his perspective. After decades of carrying expectations that were never fully his own, after years of silence shaped by loyalty, confusion, and survival, Marvis has made a deliberate choice. He is ready to speak, not to accuse, not to settle scores, but to finally tell the truth as he lived it. "I think it's time to tell everything," Marvis says. Those words do not come from bitterness or resentment. They come from clarity, from a man who has spent a lifetime shadowboxing memories, assumptions, and a last name that weighed heavier than any opponent he ever faced in the ring. This is not a story about tearing down a legend. It is about humanizing one. It is about separating the myth of Smokiin Joe Frazier from a man who came home exhausted, silent, and burdened by the same pressures that made him great. To the world, Joe Frazier will forever be remembered as the relentless warrior who stood toe-to-toe with Muhammad Ali, a symbol of toughness carved in sweat, blood, and unbreakable will. His legacy is cemented in history books, highlight reels, and reverent storytelling. But legends are often flattened by admiration. They are turned into symbols instead of people. And for Marvis, that public image never told the whole story. Growing up as Joe Frazier's son was not a simple privilege. It was a contradiction. On one side, there was material comfort, opportunity, and a famous name that opened doors. On the other, there was isolation, violence, misunderstanding, and a constant demand to live up to an image he never chose. Marvis did not grow up chasing fame. He grew up trying to survive it, trying to understand why admiration could so easily turn into cruelty, and why being connected to greatness could feel like a curse. For years, Marvis stayed quiet. Part of that silence came from respect. Another part came from the understanding that the public often hears only what it wants to hear. People already believed they knew his story simply because they knew his father's name. Correcting that illusion felt impossible. And so Marvis carried his truth privately, allowing the world to keep its simplified version of Joe Frazier, while he lived a far more complicated reality. But time changes things. Distance from the ring brings reflection. Age brings urgency. And the realization that silence can erase nuance becomes impossible to ignore. As Marvis looks back on his life, his childhood, his boxing career, his relationship with his father, he understands that some truths deserve light, even if they are uncomfortable, even if they disrupt familiar narratives. Yes, he confirms that many of the rumors were true, but not in the way people think. The truth is not scandalous or sensational. It is human. It is layered. It is a story of a father who loved deeply but struggled to show it, a son who wanted approval more than applause, and a legacy that was both a gift and a burden. This story is about identity, about what happens when a child grows up inside a shadow cast by greatness, about how legacy can shape, pressure, and sometimes fracture the people closest to it, and about how, after decades of being defined by someone else's story, a man finally claims his own voice. For the first time, Marvis Frazier is not speaking as Joe Frazier's son, the boxer, or the extension of a legend. He is speaking as himself. And in doing so, he is offering the world a fuller, more honest understanding of who Joe Frazier really was. Not just as a champion, but as a father, a man, and a complicated human being. This is not revenge. This is not rewriting history. This is confirmation. And it begins now. The weight of a name. From the moment Marvis Frazier entered the world, his identity was never fully his own. Long before he could understand what boxing was, before he could grasp why strangers reacted to his last name with awe or hostility, he was already living under the shadow of one of the most powerful figures in sports history. To be Joe Frazier's son was not simply a family connection. It was a label that shaped how others treated him. how they judged him, and how they decided what kind of person he was supposed to be. I grew up being the son of the former heavyweight champion of the world, Smokiin Joe Frazier, Marvis explains, his voice carrying both pride and exhaustion. And growing up as Joe Frazier's son had two very different sides. That duality defined his childhood. On the surface, it looked like privilege. People assumed wealth, comfort, and protection came automatically with the name. They imagined a life of ease, respect, and admiration. But that assumption could not have been further from the truth. Few names in boxing history carry the same weight as Joe Frazier's. He was the man who handed Muhammad Ali his first professional loss. A relentless fighter whose reputation was built not on flash, but on endurance, discipline, and raw willpower. To fans, Joe Frazier was a symbol of toughness. To promoters and commentators, he was a living legend. But to Marvis, that same name felt like both a gift and a trap. On one hand, there were undeniable advantages. Anything a kid could want materially, I had, Marvis admits. His father's success meant financial stability, opportunities, and access that most children could only dream of. There was never a question of whether the bills would be paid or whether food would be on the table. In that sense, Joe Frazier took care of his family, the only way he knew how, through hard work and sacrifice. But what people rarely saw was the cost of carrying that name into spaces where fame offered no protection. At school, admiration quickly turned into resentment. Instead of being impressed, other children felt challenged by his existence. Everybody and their sister used to beat me up in school because I was Joe Frazier's son, Marvis recalls bluntly. It wasn't playful teasing or harmless rivalry. It was physical, constant, and deeply confusing for a child who hadn't done anything to earn that kind of hostility. To his peers, Marvis wasn't just another kid. He was a test. If Joe Frazier was the toughest man in the world, then surely his son should be tough too. And if he wasn't, then he became a target. The logic was cruel but simple. Other children wanted to see if they could hurt the champion's son. They wanted to prove something to themselves by breaking what they assumed should be unbreakable. Teachers didn't intervene the way they should have. Adults often misunderstood the situation entirely. They assumed privilege erased pain, that having a famous father somehow canceled out fear, loneliness, or trauma. No one stopped to ask Marvis what it felt like to be surrounded by expectations he never agreed to carry. They believed they already knew his story. That misunderstanding followed him everywhere. In one moment, he was expected to feel grateful for his last name. In the next, he was expected to defend it with his fists. Being Joe Frazier's son was never neutral. It was either admired or challenged, but rarely understood. Marvis learned early that the spotlight doesn't always shine warmly. Sometimes it burns. Even at home, the pressure didn't disappear. Joe Frazier was not a man who coddled his children. He believed in toughness, discipline, and resilience because those values had carried him out of poverty and into greatness. But that meant Marvis grew up feeling that vulnerability wasn't an option. Crying didn't fit the image. Fear didn't fit the name. And weakness, real or perceived, was something the world was eager to punish. Behind closed doors, Marvis slowly realized that wearing his father's name didn't mean he inherited his armor. He didn't automatically have his father's strength, his endurance, or his ability to absorb punishment. And yet, people expected him to. That contradiction created a deep internal conflict. He wanted to honor his father, but he also wanted to survive his own childhood. This chapter of Marvis Frazier's life set the foundation for everything that followed. He would never know anonymity. Every success would be minimized, every failure magnified. He wasn't allowed to simply grow. He was expected to represent something larger than himself. And as a child, that weight was overwhelming. There were moments when Marvis wished he could escape it entirely, to be just another kid, to walk into a room without his last name arriving before he did. But legacy doesn't offer an off switch. It follows you into classrooms, onto playgrounds, and eventually into adulthood. For years, Marvis tried to navigate that reality quietly. He didn't complain. He didn't lash out publicly. He internalized it, believing that speaking up wouldn't change how people saw him anyway. The image of Joe Frazier was already too powerful, too fixed, too legendary. And yet, beneath the silence, something was forming, a desire not to run from the name forever, but to eventually understand on his own terms. That struggle between rejecting the weight of his father's legacy and learning how to carry it would later pull him toward the boxing ring itself. At the time, Marvis didn't know that this tension between identity and expectation would define his life. He only knew that being Joe Frazier's son was not just a fact. It was a battle he fought every single day, long before he ever put on gloves. Hiding the name when legacy becomes a target. As Marvis Frazier grew older, the weight of his last name did not lessen. If anything, it became heavier, sharper, and more dangerous. Childhood should have been a time of discovery and innocence. But for Marvis, it was a period defined by vigilance. Every new classroom, every new neighborhood, every new group of peers carried the same unspoken question. Was he really Joe Frazier's son? And once that question was answered, the consequences often followed swiftly. It got so bad being Joe Frazier's son that I would lie about who my father was, Marvis admits. That confession is not made lightly. For a child to deny their parent is not an act of shame. It is an act of survival. The more famous Joe Frazier became, the more dangerous Marvis's daily life felt. Fame amplified resentment. Admiration for the champion transformed into aggression toward his child. And Marvis learned, through repeated physical confrontations, that honesty about his identity often led to pain. This was not casual bullying. It was systematic and relentless. Other kids did not see Marvis as an individual. They saw him as an extension of a myth. To them, he represented a challenge, a chance to prove something. If they could beat up the son of the heavyweight champion, even symbolically, it gave him a twisted sense of power. And if Marvis didn't fight back the way they expected, it only fueled their cruelty. The logic was brutal. If Joe Frazier could fight the best men in the world, then his son should be able to fight too. And if he couldn't, then maybe the legend was exaggerated. Maybe the name didn't mean as much as people thought. Marvis became a testing ground for other people's insecurities, jealousies, and fantasies about strength. To cope, he chose invisibility. Lying about who his father was became a shield. It was the only way to move through the world without constantly being forced into conflict. He didn't deny his father out of embarrassment. He denied him to protect himself. That distinction matters. Behind closed doors, his loyalty never wavered. But in public, anonymity felt safer than legacy. While the world obsessed over Joe Frazier's career, Marvis wanted distance from it. He didn't want to hear about the fights, the belts, or the rivalries. Each mention was a reminder that his father's greatness came at a personal cost he was paying for daily. The irony was painful. The very thing that brought pride to millions brought fear to one child. In classrooms, teachers often misunderstood the situation. Some assumed Marvis was privileged and tough enough to handle it. Others believed conflicts involving him must be mutual, not realizing how often he was targeted simply for existing. Rarely did anyone stop to ask how it felt to be constantly challenged for a legacy he never chose. The playground offered no escape. There was no glory in being the son of a heavyweight champion there. There was only suspicion and aggression. Other children wanted to see how far they could push him. They wanted reactions. They wanted proof that he was either worthy of a name or undeserving of it. Either way, Marvis lost. This environment created a deep internal conflict. Marvis loved his father. He admired him, but he also associated his father's name with pain. That contradiction is difficult for any child to process. How do you reconcile love for a parent with a harm that comes from being connected to them publicly? How do you explain that to a child who just wants peace? Even as he denied his father's identity in public, Marvis never denied him privately. There was no resentment, no anger directed at Joe himself. The struggle was not about blame. It was about identity. Marvis was trying to carve out space to exist without constantly being measured against a standard that was impossible to meet. This experience shaped him in ways that lasted far beyond childhood. It taught him to guard his emotions, to anticipate conflict, to expect misunderstanding. It also planted a quiet question deep inside him. Was being Joe Frazier's son a blessing or a curse? That question would follow him into adulthood. into the boxing gym, and eventually into the ring. For many children of celebrities, a famous last name is a source of pride and confidence. For Marvis, it became something he actively tried to hide, not because he rejected his father, but because the world refused to see him as anything else. His individuality was constantly overshadowed by a legacy too large for a child to carry. Looking back now, Marvis understands the toll that secrecy took on him. Lying about his father created distance, even when he didn't want it. It forced him to compartmentalize his life, to be one person at home and another in public. That kind of split identity leaves scars, but at the time it felt necessary. Every punch he took in school hallways reinforced the same lesson. Fame does not protect families. It exposes them. It turns children into symbols and removes their right to simply grow. And while the world celebrated Joe Frazier's strength, Marvis was learning that strength sometimes means staying silent, even when it hurts. By admitting now that he lied about who his father was, Marvis isn't seeking sympathy. He's offering context. He's confirming that legacy, when imposed too early and too heavily, can wound just as deeply as it can inspire. And for a long time, that wound remained unspoken. This chapter of his life explains why Marvis stayed quiet for so many years, why he didn't rush to correct public narratives, why he allowed others to assume they understood his childhood. They didn't. And now, decades later, he's finally explaining why. Chasing the legacy, burden or calling, when Marvis Frazier committed fully to boxing, he wasn't just choosing a sport. He was stepping into a legacy already written in blood, sweat, and history. Every punch he threw, every victory he earned, and every mistake he made would be filtered through a single, unavoidable comparison. He was not simply Marvis. He was Joe Frazier's son. And in the world of boxing, that distinction mattered more than anything else. I didn't know about the danger of the sport at the time, Marvis admits. I just wanted to be like my daddy. That desire was pure. It wasn't driven by money or fame. It was rooted in admiration and love. But boxing doesn't reward innocence. It demands payment in pain. And very quickly, Marvis learned that chasing a legacy means carrying its weight as well. The myth breaks, seeing Joe Frazier as human. For much of his early life, Marvis Frazier did not see his father as an ordinary man. Joe Frazier existed in a different category altogether, somewhere between hero and myth. To a young boy, his father was not just strong, he was invincible. The world reinforced that belief at every turn. Crowds cheered his name. Commentators spoke of him with reverence. Newspapers framed his victories as proof of superhuman will. And inside Marvis's mind, there was no space for doubt. In my heart, nobody in the world could beat my dad, Marvis remembers. My dad was the strongest man in the world. That belief wasn't naive. It was emotional truth. Joe Frazier represented safety, power, and certainty in a world that often felt hostile. When everything else seemed unpredictable, his father's strength felt absolute. But even legends cannot escape reality forever. For Marvis, the moment when the myth crack came during one of the most brutal and historic fights in boxing history, the Thriller in Manila. In 1975, Joe Frazier faced Muhammad Ali for the third and final time in a bout that pushed both men beyond the limits of endurance. The fight was not just a contest of skill. It was a test of survival. Marvis remembers watching his father that day with a mixture of pride and fear. This wasn't just another fight. This was war. Round after round, Joe absorbed punishment that would have broken most men. His body slowed. His face swelled. His breathing grew labored. And yet he refused to quit. To Marvis, that refusal was both inspiring and terrifying. The defining moment came when Joe's trainer, Eddie Futch, made a decision that would echo far beyond the ring. Seeing that Joe could no longer defend himself properly, Futch chose to stop the fight. "Joe, I'm stopping the fight," he told him. Joe protested. "No, Eddie, don't stop the fight. Please don't stop the fight." Those words revealed something Marvis had never seen before. In that moment, Joe Frazier was no longer untouchable. He was exhausted, desperate, human. For the first time in his life, Marvis saw vulnerability in the man he had always believed was indestructible. That was the first time I realized my dad was human. Marvis says quietly, the realization didn't weaken his love. At the end of it all, Marvis Frazier's story isn't just about boxing or legacy. It's about understanding, forgiveness, and the courage it takes to finally speak your truth. Behind the legend of Joe Frazier was a real man, and behind the famous name was a son doing his best to find his own identity. Marvis didn't tell this story to change history, but to complete it. And in doing so, he reminds us that even the greatest icons are human, and every legacy is deeper than what the world sees. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do isn't throwing a punch. It's telling the truth,